The era is 13th century BC. A young nomad named Moses is shepherding his flock somewhere in the desert of southeastern Nubia. After walking his sheep to the outskirts of the desert, he stumbles across a mountain. After getting a little closer, he hears a voice that introduces itself as God.
I am that I am. I don't understand.
After engaging in a personal conversation with this voice, Moses is ordered to go back to Egypt to free his people from bondage. He will return again to this mountain one more time, and this time to receive the 10 Commandments and the Torah with all its 613 laws. The number 613 will be very important at the end of this episode. And the voice that spoke to Moses in private at the foot of this mountain will again speak to the Hebrews, to a nation consisting of more than 1 million people, who will hear the voice of God plainly and without an intermediary or a prophet for the first and final time in human history. The place where all this happened was at the holy Mount Sinai. The history of Mount Sinai begins in Exodus 2, with the story of Moses stumbling across this mountain while he was in the land of Midian. Before the book of Exodus, there is no explicit mention of Mount Sinai in the Bible. It is also during Moses' lifetime that this mountain receives the most attention, as the central place where God's law was received, and the Israelites were instructed on how to obey and worship God. In the centuries following Moses' death, Mount Sinai will receive little to no attention, and there is almost no emphasis on this mountain in the books following the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The focus will instead shift to Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and every mention of Mount Sinai in the latter books of the Old Testament are mere memorials of what happened in the days of Moses. Neither will the Israelites visit this mountain again after Moses' death, and it will take at least 500 years before Mount Sinai is visited again, and this time by the prophet Elijah, who escapes to this mountain to hide from an oppressive government and to communicate with God. After Elijah's visit, Mount Sinai simply disappears from the books and is never visited again. Following the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the dispersal of the Israelites throughout the African continent, the historical connection to ancient Israel and all its holy sites and landmarks was broken and lost forever. A new religion, Christianity, began to sweep the region, and the ancient Judaic history of Ethiopia was forgotten. For more details, please watch the video Crash Course on Lost Hebrew Israelite History. Following the return to the land of Canaan after the Babylonian captivity, a wave of convert Jews of Persian origin began to spread throughout the Middle East and Asia. This group began writing its own version of biblical history and began identifying random landmarks and sites in the Near East with legendary biblical landmarks, like the Jordan River, Mount Zion, and others. One biblical landmark that remained a mystery even to these convert Jews was Mount Sinai, which no rabbi or sage from ancient times attempted to identify with any specific site. In spite of this historical reality, there is still some archaeological evidence that indicates that an early group of Jews identified a mountain in the Levant as biblical Mount Sinai. Keeping up with the common belief of the time that the Israelites, on the exodus out of Egypt, migrated east and settled in the Mediterranean, these Jews naturally identified the desert between Egypt and modern-day Israel as the biblical Sinai Desert, and the mountains in this region as the most logical candidates for biblical Mount Sinai. The first attempt to identify biblical Mount Sinai with a specific mountain was done by Josephus. He located Mount Sinai in Arabia Petra, which correlates with modern-day Jordan, parts of Syria, and neighboring regions. Another attempt was made by St. Paul in the following century, who gave an even more vague description of Mount Sinai and claimed that it was located in Arabia. The mountain that has been identified the most with biblical Mount Sinai is Jabal Musa in modern-day Sinai Desert. Egyptian monks of the 4th century, who were escaping the busy and worldly milieu of the inner cities, began to flee to the deserts of Egypt, particularly to the modern Sinai Desert. This was an imitation of Old Testament prophets like Elijah, who fled the cities of ancient Israel and escaped to Mount Sinai to find God. These monks considered the place of their migration their own Sinai Desert and named it appropriately the Sinai Desert. Egypt's eastern desert before this time in history was not known as the Sinai Desert. Once they settled in this area, they identified a particular mountain in the region as biblical Mount Sinai. That mountain was Jabal Musa. The first record of Jabal Musa being identified as Mount Sinai comes from the writings of a lady pilgrim named Ethiopia, who gave a detailed record of her visit to Jabal Musa and neighboring regions. Her writings, which have been viewed by some as empirical proof that Jabal Musa is indeed biblical Mount Sinai, represent no more than a record of the beliefs of these 4th century monks, who genuinely convinced themselves that the area of their pilgrimage was holy, and that their favorite mountain in this region was indeed biblical Mount Sinai. Few centuries go by, and the monks began to get attacked by Arab brigands. To protect them, Emperor Justinian built a monastery where these monks could hide. This was the St. Catherine Monastery, which was erected in the area of their settling. The construction of the monastery near the believed Mount Sinai was interpreted by the common people as an official stamp of approval from the Catholic Church that the area was indeed holy, and that Jabal Musa was definitely biblical Mount Sinai. This sealed the deal and started a 1600 years long tradition that identifies an arbitrary mountain in the Levant with biblical Mount Sinai.